What happens when a woman stripped of everything: home, dignity, even her clothes, is wrapped in a wool blanket by a silent rancher who says only, "You're coming with me. Is it salvation or just another cage?" And when her tormentors return, whose strength will decide the ending. The wind was a blade and I was the flesh it flayed. It didn't seem to care that there was little left of me to cut. The cold was a more intimate cruelty seeping up from the packed frozen earth through the soles of my bare feet. A paralytic numbness that was climbing my legs, threatening to still my heart. But my heart was already a stone in my chest, heavy and cold and dead. "You're coming with me." The voice cut through the wind's howl. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unyielding as the iron-gray mountains that clawed at the bruised winter sky. The snow, driven by the ceaseless wind, clung to everything. A fine crystalline powder coating the cracked leather of his boots, the steaming flanks of his dark horse, and my own pale exposed skin. I stood shivering, not just from the cold, but from a shame so profound it had hollowed me out, leaving nothing but a fragile shell. 3 men, the kin of my late husband Thomas, stood near their wagon. Their faces were a grotesque mixture of smug satisfaction and raw contempt. They had performed their final public act of dispossession. After taking my home, my name, and the last of my meager possessions, they had taken my dignity, stripping me bare in the merciless glare of the winter sun, and leaving me on the border of a stranger's land. Jonah Barlow, the eldest of them, a man whose soul had long since shriveled behind a hard-pinched face and eyes like chips of flint, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the pristine snow. The stain was ugly, a violation. "She's chattel," he rasped, his voice thin and sharp as a shard of ice. "Property owed to us as recompense for our brother's foolish investment. You've no business here, Silas." The man named Silas did not so much as glance at them. His gaze, a startling clear gray like a winter lake, was fixed on me. I felt it not as a violation, but as a witnessing. He saw the violent tremor in my shoulders, the way my eyes stared at a point in the far distance, a desperate attempt to transport myself anywhere but here. I refused to meet the eyes of my tormentors, and I could not bring myself to meet the eyes of this unexpected rescuer. He swung down from his horse in a single fluid motion, his movements economical and deliberate. There was no wasted energy in him, nothing for show. He was a man carved from the same hard substance as the land itself. He moved to the back of his saddle and untied a thick, heavy wool blanket. As he walked toward me, the space between us seemed to suck all the sound from the world. The wind died to a whisper. The chuffing of his horse, the creak of the wagon, it all faded into a roaring silence in my ears. He didn't speak again as he wrapped the heavy fabric around me. His hands were large and calloused, yet he was careful, so profoundly careful, not to let his fingers brush against my skin. The gesture was one of deep, impersonal respect that struck me with more force than a blow. He was not touching a woman. He was sheltering a creature in distress. The rough wool scratched against my skin, but the weight of it was a comfort and anchor in the dizzying vortex of my humiliation. Only then did he turn to face the Barlows. His expression was unchanged, as placid and formidable as a frozen river. "Get off my land." The words were spoken softly, yet they carried the absolute finality of a rock slide. Jonah's cruel mouth opened, then snapped shut. His 2 brutish sons, hulking figures of dull malice, shifted their weight, their hands hovering near the knives on their belts. But they did nothing. They saw something in Silas's stillness, in the unblinking calm of his gray eyes, that their own brand of loud, boorish cruelty could not challenge. It was like watching curs back away from a wolf, defeated not by a threat of violence but by a will. Far stronger than their own malice, they grumbled, climbed back onto their wagon, and retreated, their angry shouts swallowed by the rising wind. The journey back to his homestead was a silent procession against the vast, indifferent sky. I sat huddled in front of him on the saddle, the coarse wool of the blanket a rough shield against the world. I could feel the solid wall of his chest at my back, a steady, unthreatening presence that asked for nothing. It was the first time in months I had felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was not safety, not yet, but it was the possibility of it. I focused on the rhythm of the horse's gait, the soft crunch of its hooves on the snow-covered earth, the creak of the leather. Each step took me further from the life that had been dismantled piece by piece, then shattered in a final cruel gesture. Thomas, my sweet, gentle Thomas, had died of a winter fever just 6 months prior. He was a kind man, but a weak one, and his family had always seen me as a burden, a drain on their resources, a woman who had failed in her primary duty to provide them with an heir. His death had been my damnation. The wind whispered through the skeletal branches of the aspens, carrying the clean, sharp scent of pine and coming snow. Silas rode with a stillness that seemed to be a part of the landscape itself, his eyes constantly scanning the rolling white hills and shadowed canyons with an ingrained vigilance. He did not speak, did not offer platitudes or ask questions I had no answers for. His silence was a refuge, a vast quiet space, where I could begin to gather the scattered broken fragments of myself without the pressure of explanation or performance. The sun, a pale watery disk, began its slow descent, painting the western clouds in brutal strokes of blood orange and violet, the colors of a fresh wound. The fading light caught the sharp lines of his face, revealing a map of sun and hardship etched around his eyes. He was not a handsome man in the way of poets or kings, but there was an integrity in his posture, a raw-boned strength that was more compelling than any manufactured charm. As the first stars pricked the deepening twilight, a faint glimmer of a single lantern appeared in the distance, a tiny spark of warmth in the immense gathering dark. It was the first sign of a destination, a place I was being taken to, not a place I had chosen. And the fear, cold and sharp, briefly returned. I was trading one cage for another, perhaps, one master for another. The thought sent a fresh wave of trembling through me. His ranch was nestled in a small protected valley, a collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings that looked as if they had grown from the earth itself. A modest house with a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, a solid barn, and a web of fences stood against the encroaching wilderness, a testament to relentless effort and quiet endurance. He led the horse to a trough, breaking the sheet of ice on top with a single sharp blow of his fist. He slid from the saddle and then reached up for me. His hands were calloused and sure as they circled my waist, lifting me down to the ground. For a moment my legs, numb and weak, would not hold me. I swayed, and he steadied me without a word, his grip firm until I found my balance. The contact was brief, impersonal, yet it was the first human touch in a year that had not been meant to cause me pain or humiliation. Inside the house was sparse and clean. A great stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. The furniture was handmade, worn smooth with years of use. There was a faint scent of wood smoke, coffee, and old leather. It was a man's home, solitary and self-contained. He pointed to a closed door. "That room is yours. There are clothes on the bed. They were my mother's." He didn't wait for a reply but moved to the stove, his actions practical, his focus already on the next necessary task. He lit a fire in the hearth, the crackle and flare of the kindling filling the quiet room with a sudden welcome life. I went into the room he had indicated. A simple heavy cotton dress and a worn shift were laid out on the patchwork quilt of a narrow bed. They were clean and smelled of lye soap and sunshine, a scent from a forgotten season. I let the heavy wool blanket, the last remnant of my public shame, fall to the floor. I dressed in the borrowed clothes. They hung loosely on my frame, for I had lost much weight in my grief and subsequent hardship, but they were a shield. They were a beginning. When I emerged, he had 2 tin plates of venison stew and dark bread on the simple wooden table. We ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons on tin and the soft sigh of the fire as it consumed the logs. I watched him over the rim of my spoon, this quiet, severe man who had intervened with the force of a natural law. He ate with the same focused intention he applied to everything his gaze directed at his plate. He asked nothing of me, not even my name. It was a mercy I hadn't known I needed. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was not required to be anything to anyone. I could simply be. The first days passed in a slow, silent rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Silas rose before dawn, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards the only alarm clock. He would be gone for hours, tending to his few cattle, mending fences, clearing snow, existing in a state of constant, purposeful motion. He left food for me on the table, a piece of bread, a bowl of stew, without ceremony. He did not intrude on my solitude, did not knock on my door. He gave me space as if it were a physical commodity, a balm for a wound he could not see but knew was there. I remained within the walls of the house, a pale ghost haunting the edges of his life. I explored the small space, my bare feet silent on the cool plank floors. The house was a reflection of the man. Everything had a purpose. There was no clutter, no sentimentality, save for a few items I found in the room I had claimed. In a small wooden box on the dresser, I found a few cherished possessions, clearly his mother's. A set of birds whittled from pine with incredible detail. a faded photograph of a stern-looking woman with Silas's unyielding gray eyes, and a single chipped porcelain teacup, its delicate handle broken off long ago. I held the fragile cup in my hands, its uselessness a strange comfort. It was broken like me, but it was still in its own way beautiful. It had not been thrown away. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need for air that felt thick and close in the cabin, I pulled the heavy blanket from the bed around my shoulders and stepped onto the porch. The cold was shocking, a slap that stole my breath, but the sun was bright, reflecting off the snow with a blinding intensity. The air was sharp and clean. In the distance, I could see Silas, a solitary figure repairing a section of fence line, the rhythmic strike of his hammer, a steady heartbeat against the vast silence of the valley. He did not turn or wave, but I saw his movements slow for a fraction of a second, a minute hesitation that told me he knew I was there watching. It was the first time I had willingly stepped out to meet the world, and he had granted me the dignity of not making it a spectacle. He let me be, and in doing so gave me the courage to stay. A week after my arrival, I saw it. I was staring out the small window in my room, watching the snow drift down from a leaden sky, when my eyes caught movement. A dark speck on the distant eastern ridge, a place where no rider should be. It was too far to make out details, but I knew. I knew with a cold certainty that settled deep in my bones, a familiar dread that coiled in my gut. The Barlows. They were watching. The figure remained for nearly an hour, a silent, malevolent sentinel, before finally disappearing back over the rise. A shiver unrelated to the day's chill traced a path down my spine. The valley no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a cage with a wolf circling it. I retreated from the window, the walls of the house suddenly feeling thin and fragile. That evening, Silas came in from his chores, stomping the snow from his boots on the porch. He did not immediately start preparing dinner as he usually did. Instead, he laid a worn piece of oilcloth on the table and carefully began to disassemble his rifle. He worked under the quiet hiss of the lantern, his large hands moving with a practiced, unnerving grace. He cleaned each piece methodically, the metallic scrape and click of the components echoing in the small, warm room. He did not speak of the rider on the ridge. He did not acknowledge the threat that now hung in the air between us. But his actions were a conversation in themselves. I sat in a chair by the hearth, watching him, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap, my knuckles were white. The methodical cleaning of the weapon was not an act of aggression, but one of sober preparation. It was an acknowledgement of the world outside their quiet valley, a world that had not forgotten me. I understood then that his protection was not a momentary act of charity. It was a responsibility he had shouldered, and he would not set it down lightly. He had claimed me in a way, not as property as the Barlows had, but as a person under his watch. The air grew thick with unspoken understanding, a shared knowledge of the danger that lay waiting just beyond the horizon. One night, the sharp, distressed bleating of a ewe woke the homestead. A storm had moved in from the north, the wind moaning around the corners of the house like a grieving spirit rattling the window panes. I heard Silas's boots hit the floor in the other room. A moment later, I saw the beam of his lantern pass my window as he headed for the barn. Driven by an instinct I didn't understand, an impulse to be useful, to be part of something other than my own misery, I pulled on the boots he had left for me, worn but warm, and followed him out into the churning darkness. In the small birthing pen near the barn, a ewe was struggling. A lamb was breeched, its tiny form barely breathing. The wind whipped at us, threatening to extinguish the lantern's fragile flame. Silas worked with a calm, focused urgency, his hands surprisingly gentle but firm as he tried to reposition the lamb. "Hold this," he commanded, his voice tight, with effort, gesturing with his head toward the lantern. "Keep the light steady." I took it, my hand surprisingly firm as I held the warm glass, angling the beam so he could see. I knelt in the dirt, and straw the wind tearing at my hair, the snow stinging my face, and held the light unwavering. Time seemed to suspend, marked only by the heaving breaths of the ewe and Silas's low murmuring reassurances. He spoke to the animal with a tenderness I had not yet heard in his voice. Finally, with a great effort, the lamb was born slick and still. For a heart-stopping moment, it didn't move. My own heart stopped with it. Silas cleared its airway with his finger and rubbed its small body vigorously with a piece of burlap. Then a shudder, a weak, wavering cry. It was alive. A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over me. We had saved it. Together. As Silas settled the lamb with its mother, he glanced at me, his face illuminated by the lantern I still held. His expression was unreadable in the flickering light, but his gaze lingered for a moment longer than usual. In that look, I felt a flicker of partnership, of shared victory against the harshness of the night. Later, back in the warmth of the house, as the first drops of freezing rain began to pelt the roof, I spoke. "Thank you." The two words were small against the growing roar of the storm, but they were the first I had offered freely, the first that were not born of fear or necessity. He simply nodded, turning to put another log on the fire. But that simple gesture carried the weight of a lengthy conversation. Something had shifted between us. A wall had come down. In the weeks that followed, a quiet transformation began. The silence between us shifted from one of necessity to one of comfort. It was no longer a void, but a shared space. I started to venture out more, first just to the porch, then to the small snow-covered vegetable patch behind the house. I found a rusty trowel in the barn and began to methodically turn the frozen soil, preparing it for a spring I now dared to believe I would see. The work was grounding a way to reclaim a piece of the world for myself. I discovered a small spring of mint growing wild by the fence, somehow surviving under the snow. I began to tend to it, clearing the snow away and protecting it with stones. One afternoon, Silas came back from his work to find a glass of cool mint water waiting for him on the porch rail. He stopped, looked at the glass, then at me where I sat on the steps. He picked it up and drank it all in one long draught. He gave me that same small nod of thanks, and it was all the communication that was needed. I began to take on small tasks around the house. I mended a tear in his work shirt with neat, precise stitches, a skill my mother had taught me long ago. I swept the floors until they shone. I learned the rhythms of his home, the way he liked his coffee, the time he returned for his midday meal. These were not acts of servitude, but acts of partnership, of creating a shared existence. I was no longer a ghost. I was becoming a presence. One evening, as we sat by the fire, the wind howling its lonely song outside, I finally told him. My voice was low, and even a recitation of facts rather than a plea for sympathy. I had cried all my tears. Now all that was left was the story. My husband's name was Thomas, I began, and the sound of his name on my lips was both a comfort and a pain. He was gentle. He loved books more than the land. His family, the Barlows, they never thought he was strong enough. They never thought I was good enough. I spoke of his death from the fever that had swept through the valley, how quickly he had faded. I spoke of how his family saw me as nothing more than a failed investment, another mouth to feed the woman who had produced no heir to carry their name. They had taken the farm, the livestock, the few things Thomas and I had built together. And when they had decided to finally cast me out, they took my clothes as a final bitter lesson in ownership. To show the world that I was nothing, that I belonged to them even in my disgrace. Silas listened without interruption. He did not move his hands, resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The only sign of his reaction was a muscle that clenched and unclenched in his jaw, a small, hard knot of controlled fury. He was angry on my behalf. The realization was a sudden warmth that spread through my chest, chasing away some of the deep, abiding chill. When I finished, a profound quiet settled over the room. It was not the empty quiet of my first days here, but a quiet of shared knowledge of a burden finally set down and witnessed. He had not offered empty words of comfort. He had offered me his stillness, his attention, his silent anger. It was more than enough. The sky had been a bruised purple all day, the air heavy and electric with a coming storm. The cattle were restless, lowing nervously in the pasture. Silas was reinforcing the barn door when he saw them. 3 riders cresting the familiar eastern ridge. No longer distant specks, but clear and resolute figures moving with grim purpose through the falling snow. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his trousers, his face a mask of stone. He walked to the house, his stride unhurried, measured. I was on the porch, my hands gripping the railing so hard my knuckles were white. I had seen them too. The world shrank to the 3 dark figures approaching, and the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. "Alara, go inside," he said. His voice was quiet but absolute. He had never used my name before. I hadn't even realized he knew it. I hesitated, my eyes wide with a familiar paralyzing terror. I could not move. My feet were rooted to the spot. "Go inside," he repeated, softer this time, but with an edge of tempered steel that brooked no argument. I retreated into the house, leaving the door slightly ajar, my eye pressed to the crack. Silas did not get his rifle. He simply stood on the top step of the porch, his arms loose at his sides, waiting. He was a solitary, immovable object against the backdrop of the swirling snow. The 3 Barlow men rode into the yard, their horses kicking up slush. Jonah, flanked by his 2 brutish sons, pulled his mount to a halt. "We've come for what's ours, Silas." The old man sneered, his voice thin and cruel. The woman, send her out. Silas's gaze was steady. She's not yours. The younger son, Luke, a man whose face was a testament to a life of casual cruelty, dismounted. He had a length of rope in his hand and a smug predatory grin on his face. She island. By law, and by right, we mean to have her back. He took a step toward the porch. She stays, Silas said. His voice, though low, carried over the rising wind with the finality of a closing door. Luke lunged forward. Silas's movement was a blur of speed and brutal efficiency. He didn't throw a punch. He stepped down to meet the man, not with a fist, but with his entire body, a block of solid force that sent Luke sprawling backward into the dirt. It was over in a second. Jonah and the other brother reached for the pistols tucked in their belts, but froze as Silas looked up at them. His gray eyes were no longer calm. They were blazing with a cold fire they had never seen before. A fire that promised not a quick death, but a slow and thorough dismantling. Leave, Silas said, and don't come back. It was not a threat. It was a prophecy. They hesitated, their bluster and malice shriveling in the face of his absolute conviction. They were men who understood loud violence, the crack of a whip, the power of a gun. They did not understand this. They did not understand a man who could win a war without shouting. Defeated, they grabbed their fallen family member, hauling him onto his horse, and retreated. Their angry shouts were swallowed by the first clap of thunder that rolled through the valley. As they galloped away, a pathetic, dwindling trio, the heavens opened. A deluge of cleansing rain began to fall, melting the snow, washing the world clean. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the air washed and smelling of wet earth and pine. The world seemed brighter, the colors more vivid. The tension that had hung over the valley for weeks was gone, washed away with the rain. In its wake, a new, more gentle quiet settled between Silas and me. It was a peace born not of avoidance, but of a confrontation, faced and won. Life fell into a new rhythm, one of collaboration. I worked alongside him now, my initial fragility replaced by a quiet, resilient strength I hadn't known I possessed. I learned to patch the roof, to check the fences, to identify the herbs that grew in the foothills. He, in turn, began to soften in small ways. He would leave a wildflower on the table for me in the mornings, or point out the hawk that circled high above the valley. Words were still sparse between them, but they were no longer as necessary. Our communication existed in shared tasks, in knowing glances and the simple comfort of occupying the same space. We were building something wordlessly day by day. One afternoon, Silas came into the house to find that I had finally finished my project. The broken teacup sat on the kitchen windowsill. I had spent weeks painstakingly gathering the shards from the box, cleaning them and piecing them back together with a resin made from pine sap. The cracks were visible, a web of fine dark lines, but it was whole, and it was no longer empty. I had filled it with the tiny vibrant purple flowers that grew wild by the creek. Silas stopped and looked at it for a long time. He reached out and gently touched one of the petals, his calloused finger, a stark contrast to its delicate texture. He looked at me where I was watching him from across the room, and for the first time he smiled. It was not a wide grin, but a small, slow smile that transformed his stern features, lighting them from within. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, and for the first time I saw the man behind the stoic protector. In that moment, the house was no longer his house that I was inhabiting. It was our home. A quiet promise of a future pieced together and made beautiful in its brokenness had finally taken root. The seasons turned, wrapping the small valley in the gold of autumn and the stark white of another winter, before yielding again to the tender green of spring. Silas and I built a life. Our story was not one told in grand declarations or passionate embraces, but in the steady, quiet accumulation of shared moments. It was a life of shared labor and mutual respect, a silent testament to the idea that healing can be found in the solid ground beneath one's feet and in the steady, unwavering presence of another. Our sanctuary, won through a moment of defiance and built with patient, calloused hands, remained untouched by the outside world. We were two solitary souls who had, against all odds, found a way to grow together like two trees whose roots had intertwined deep beneath the soil, drawing strength from one another. Our pasts were not forgotten, but they no longer defined our present. The scars remained like the delicate lines on the mended teacup, a reminder not of the breaking, but of the profound strength it took to become whole again. On a clear spring morning, as we stood together on the porch watching the sun rise over the eastern ridge, the same ridge, where a threat had once appeared, a sense of profound peace settled over me. We had built more than a ranch. We had built a world, and in the quiet stillness of the morning with his hand resting gently on the small of my back, I knew with a certainty as deep and solid as the mountains themselves that I was finally truly home. Life has a way of testing us in quiet, relentless ways. What this story shows is that strength isn't always about loud declarations or dramatic victories. Sometimes it's found in a man who simply stands his ground, or in a woman who chooses one small step at a time to piece herself back together. For older generations who've weathered storms of their own, the lesson rings familiar: dignity can be rebuilt, not through grand gestures but through steady acts of kindness, patience, and respect. A broken teacup can be mended, and still hold beauty, just as a scarred life can still hold meaning. We don't erase the past, but we can choose not to let it own us. Instead, we honor it by building a quieter, stronger present. The story reminds us that even after loss, betrayal, or hardship, healing is possible when we allow space for trust to grow. And it is in the steady rhythm of shared work, silent understanding, and small kindnesses that true sanctuary is found. For those who've seen many seasons, this is a gentle truth worth carrying. Resilience is not being unbroken, but being whole despite the cracks. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.